All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first of the Embodied Carbon in Buildings Impact Series. My name is Rochelle Ain, and along with Julie Janitsky, we're the co-chairs of the Boston CLF Hub, which is a Carbon Leadership Forum Hub and a BSA Knowledge Community. And I'm really excited to introduce this first of the series, featuring George Gard of Brunner Cott and Laurie Ferris of Goody Clancy. And it is especially pertinent that this first of the Impact series focuses on preservation and reuse, because we believe in our efforts to reduce embodied carbon and achieve our climate goals, working with what we have is a really important first step or first consideration in our projects. So George, can you flip to the next slide? A little bit about the CLF Boston Hub. We've been around since early 2020. We are a community of practitioners across various disciplines and fields in the construction, architecture, engineering industry. We come together to share ideas. We've got initiatives. Here you see a list of our working groups. So we're tackling things from advocacy and policy to the education series, which is what's happening today, and everything in between. We also collect and provide and help each other with resources and tools to take data, account for embodied carbon, and study strategies on how to reduce it. Next slide, please. So the Impact Series is the third series here, 2021. We began in 2019 with a call to action when the BSA hosted the Embodied Carbon in Buildings Conference. Then last year, we had the successful 12-part series, the Embodied Carbon 101, introducing embodied carbon and the various aspects that embodied carbon affects in our practices and how we can address and reduce embodied carbon. This series is based on it's typology based, so that we can talk across disciplines, across our practices, across the table, and collaborate, build knowledge, ask questions, daylight issues as we build more understanding of where embodied carbon issues are and how to address them in projects. And so you'll see the list of 7 under the green rectangle there, the green square, of the different sectors that we're going to go through this June. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, today is the 7th and it's the first of the Impact Series. We have a lot going on in June. It's a really exciting month for embodied carbon in Boston. Later this week, we'll have number 2 in the series, which is in landscape. And there's also a municipal summit. So municipalities can start to think about this on a wider, urban planning type scale. And you'll be seeing this graphic as we wrap up again and discuss next steps and future opportunities for you to engage. And over on the right side, you'll see the CLF Boston Hub's next roundtable dates. We meet generally every other month. In the summer, it's an exception because we have such a busy June. We're meeting in July next, and we'll have so much energy and so much knowledge to bring in July. But we typically meet every other month, and it's a roundtable format. We talk through the working groups, talk through initiatives, talk through what's going on, and make plans for the next meeting. So I believe with that, I will hand over Impact Series 101, session number 1, to Laurie and George. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Rochelle, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Just a brief agenda. Rochelle has provided us with a wonderful intro. Laurie and I are going to talk about a few key topics. We are with an aim to sort of introduce key ideas around embodied carbon in reuse and preservation projects. And then we're going to devote about equal time to discussions. We're going to break into groups to hear from you, your thoughts and questions, really with an idea of building towards that next series that Rochelle mentioned. And then we'll all come back together to begin to summarize what we heard.
George, may I interrupt for a moment?
Yep.
This slipped my mind. I did want to point out that the chat is an active space today. So please feel free to introduce yourselves. And if you're working on an embodied carbon, please share that with the group. And you'll find we'll be posting the links to get your AIA credits. Lisa and the BSA have posted that, and also the Miro board, which we'll be using later in breakout groups.
Great.
Thank you.
So we do have learning objectives, which is a good reminder that there will also be a link to enter your AIA numbers for those of you who are interested in CEUs for today. So we have three main topics that we're going to discuss. First, making the case, then we'll talk a bit about accounting for carbon in reuse projects, and finally, advocating for change in the discipline. And within those, we'll sort of be sprinkling in some examples to help make it more concrete. So to begin with, making the case for embodied carbon considerations in preservation and reuse projects, and of course in projects more broadly as well. Sort of want to review kind of where we've been and where we're going in this discussion. I suspect that the majority of you on this call are familiar with Carl Elefante's 2007 article where he argued that the greenest building is the one that's already built. I think that that is really what laid the sort of advocacy groundwork for this now almost 15 years ago. And then building on that, a few years later was the Preservation Green Lab study, which if you have not accessed that study, I suggest it. And that really laid out the sort of approach to how we account for carbon in existing buildings and how we consider existing buildings relative to new construction. And they found that a typical new construction building, energy efficient, would overcome its sort of carbon debt from construction in 10 to 80 years, which really left open questions about how we judge the kind of relative payback period, so to speak, of reuse versus new construction. You know, in other words, if it eventually pays back, which not all projects do, is that not the greener of the two options? And Laurie will go into a bit more depth in a few minutes as to sort of how these calculations are constructed. But more recently, in 2017, the idea of time value was introduced primarily by a white paper from Larry Strain, where he argues that because of the need to rapidly draw down our emission of carbon as having the best chance of staying under 2 degrees Celsius of increased average global temperature, that carbon reductions now have more value than carbon reductions in the future. Which is also to say that carbon reductions in the future have less value than carbon reductions now. So unless that sort of crossover time, that point at which a new building becomes a lower total carbon than a reused building is quite soon, you risk sort of losing the war by the time you've won that particular battle. And of course, you know, a very low embodied energy reused building is always going to be better than new. So just by means of example, I'm using a project that we completed in our office about 4 years ago that had a very low embodied carbon for a reuse project, about 5 kilograms of CO2 per square foot, compared to a sort of abstracted new building. In this case, using numbers from a net zero project that we did around the same time that was new build at 50 kilograms of CO2 per square foot, which is relatively ambitious. So when we sort of graph these out against each other, we see that crossover time at about 28 years, or about sort of 3 times that critical 10-year window that's identified in the time value article. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Laurie, who will talk about how all of this is accounted for.
Great, thanks, George. Yeah, so I'm gonna get into the nitty-gritty of how we do this a little bit. First, I want to revisit some of the terminology that we're all becoming more familiar with, but cast it with a lens towards how we use life cycle assessment for building reuse projects. First, when we think about embodied carbon, I think we're all fairly familiar now with the concept of embodied carbon emissions as those associated with the manufacturing, transport, installation, and end of life of material or assembly. So basically the entire life cycle except for the operational phase. When we talk about reusing existing buildings, the embodied carbon of the existing or historic building is a sunk cost. Those emissions happened years, decades, centuries ago. And when we're talking about now decarbonizing the existing built environment. But when we do talk about embodied carbon of reuse, what we care about are the materials that we're adding into a building or the end of life impacts of materials we're taking out of that building. So it's really that addition and subtraction that we want to quantify the embodied impacts of when we're talking about quantifying building reuse. Next slide. The other key term, though, is avoided impacts. These are the impacts that you avoid, that you save by not doing something. So in this case, the avoided impacts, the avoided embodied carbon is the way we can talk about the savings, the quantifiable benefits of reusing an existing building or an existing building material instead of replacing it with new, which we know can be really dramatic across carbon emissions, but also across other environmental impact categories. Just quantifying the intuition we already have that reusing what already exists is better than building something new in the near term. Next. And I think Rochelle showed this list of tools on one of her earlier slides. There are a lot of tools and databases available to perform life cycle assessment. And these are the same tools that we use when we're talking about existing buildings, but we should be aware that we might be using them a little bit differently than the way they were meant to be used for traditional new construction. And particularly when we think about materials, especially in preservation, some more traditional building materials, the data may be a little bit harder to come by than say standard drywall or standard flooring. So that you sometimes have to get a little bit clever about data and about how you define the scope using these tools and data sources. Next. I think another big question that we need to ask here is what is the impact of renovation? Not just the benefit of reusing versus building new, but also what is the carbon footprint we have as we reuse buildings and upgrade them and make them more efficient and keep them viable in the future. And we've started to develop this intuition about new construction for embodied carbon. We know that building structure, primary structural systems have the bulk of the carbon footprint. We know that envelopes are typically the second most intensive system. Interiors come somewhere after that. We're still really as an industry working on MEP systems to understand which part of the pie, how much of the pie they take up. But with renovation, we don't have as solid of an intuition about that pie. And I think part of that is because renovation can mean so many different things. For example, if it's an interior fit out, the entire pie is interiors, interior finishes. And whereas if it's a comprehensive renovation, you may have a lot more structural work. So it's kind of important to understand where those levers are so that we can best reduce our impact as we reuse buildings. Next. So just to walk through a quick example of the tools and how we can talk about this, I'll just walk you through a life cycle assessment of the Leventhal Center at Boston University, which was a comprehensive renovation we completed. So all new interiors, new systems, and as well as some additions, which you can see here, both that glazed piece and the vertical circulation, as well as a penthouse on the roof. Next. So we used the plugin called Tally to do this, to perform this calculation. Tally is a plugin for Revit. And for those of you who haven't heard yet, sidebar, it was recently acquired by Building Transparency, who also owns EC3. So it will be open source and free to everyone in the near future, which is really exciting. So in any case, this is a tool you can use. And here what we've done is run Tally, but only for the new materials, only for the new assemblies and the additions and the new interior materials that were added to this building as part of the renovation. Next. So one thing we can do once we have the life cycle assessment numbers is we can understand where those levers for impact are. And we can recreate that pie chart and understand that here, because of the amount of addition and site work we had, concrete is actually a pretty large piece of the pie. Here, so are finishes, mostly drywall in this case. So we're able to kind of look material by material, system by system, and understand where we can make reductions. And in this case, starting with that biggest piece of the pie, concrete, simply by replacing a more standard traditional cast in place mix with a higher percentage of substitute cementitious materials, we can reduce the overall carbon footprint of 7%. And then the drywall, obviously, as another primary material in a renovation, can make a large impact by using better materials. Insulation is one I really want to call attention to, because this is, as Julie just put in the chat, the intersection of embodied and operational. As we add insulation, we're also improving the performance, but it does come with a carbon cost. So here, looking at replacing mineral wool with cellulose, which actually, absorbs carbon and is a carbon sink within the building. This gives us an opportunity to reduce 11% of the total carbon footprint through a single material substitution. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to think about how we not only reduce operational emissions and avoid new embodied emissions, but how can we also sink carbon into our existing buildings? Next. And then again, looking at that whole carbon, that profile over time and the time value of carbon, you can see here 3 scenarios. The green is the unrenovated building with no renovation, that the existing building as is. Orange is the renovated building as it was designed and constructed. And blue is a hypothetical replacement building with improved efficiency, which it should be noted, the renovated building was a 70% reduction below CVEX. So this would be a super ultra high performance new building. And even with that taken into consideration, again, as George pointed out earlier, the renovation results in lower total carbon through the year 2030 and even out to the year 2050 than the replacement building does. And so again, this is really important as a tool to help us understand and quantify those benefits of the upfront savings of reuse, particularly as we can improve efficiency. Next. So just to sum up quickly, some of those strategies for reducing embodied carbon as we reuse existing buildings. First, obviously reuse as much as possible. Every piece of structure and envelope and other material that we reuse is something we don't have to replace. So that is really what makes up the bulk of those avoided emissions. The second is to identify the most carbon intensive materials and really understand where those levers are so that as we invest in reducing our carbon footprint, we're really optimizing and investing properly. The third is to use carbon storing materials, again, thinking about how we can actually draw carbon down into our existing building stock as we upgrade it. And lastly, consider total carbon. This isn't just about embodied carbon, it's about balancing the embodied carbon with operational carbon and making sure that as we're making that environmental investment in new materials and systems, it's paying back quickly and giving us the carbon payback time that we need to stay within our global carbon budget. Next. I do want to note some challenges around existing and historic buildings when talking about life cycle assessment, because there are a lot of challenges and gray areas. The first, and hopefully we can discuss these all in the breakout, so I won't spend too long, but the first is just, again, the life cycle impacts of arcane or traditional building materials, which we may not have data on the material itself or the impacts of construction and installation. The second is to really think about the way we talk about embodied carbon versus avoided carbon or avoided impacts when we're talking about reuse. The third is to really think about how we quantify the benefits of salvage and reused materials. There are so many unknowns here, and I think not a lot of consensus about how we claim the benefit, although we know there is a great benefit. So that's something we can talk about. The next is uncertainty of demolition impacts. Again, this is traditionally when you perform a life cycle assessment, you're making some assumption about what happens to materials at the end of their life, but the fact is that can vary tremendously. So particularly as we demolish pieces of buildings or take out materials, how are we calculating those impacts? And then lastly, how do we better quantify and talk about the co-benefits of preservation and reuse? Because it's really not all about carbon, and it's not even all about those environmental impact categories. There are benefits of local skilled labor and economic benefits and cultural and social preservation and resilience and all the other co-benefits that I think many of us in this room are great at thinking about. So I'd love to hear more about that in the breakouts as well. Great, back to George.
Great, thanks, Lori. So just briefly before we go into the breakouts, I wanted to sort of prefigure part of what I hope that breakout discussion will be about, which is what it is that we as practitioners in preservation, reuse, and sustainability are advocating for, what it means for the sort of historic practice and future practice of those sort of sub-disciplines within the built environment, and disciplines that I hope are becoming kind of primary to the built environment. And the first is really sort of where Rochelle started us out today, which is to move the practice of sustainability into a preservation and reuse first mindset. Preservation first as a sort of slogan has been gaining traction in England in particular, but hopefully increasingly here as the sort of primary domain of sustainability, to first consider what we can do with what we have before we decide what we may need to add to the built environment. And then the second is to sort of build on this idea that the greenest building is the one that's already built, to say that we can't stop our thinking there. We have to think deeply about how we're reusing and how we're preserving. So I think both kind of the prior decades of sustainability and prior decades of preservation and reuse have some things to consider within this realm, really around this idea of carbon. And I think particularly for preservation, we're really used to thinking about competing equities between past and present, between culture, and kind of hashing those out within the profession. And I think carbon really needs to become one of those key equities that we're considering when we're preserving or reusing a building. I think it's useful to reflect upon the embodied carbon that we're currently arguing to save, the built environment that contains many of today's preservation priorities, is the same built environment that has, for the last many decades, contributed an outsized portion to carbon emissions and to energy use. And indeed, within the United States, much of the sort of preservation priorities were built right around the sort of inflection point or even after of this line. So we have to be considering that as well when we're reusing. So to pick up on something that Lori talked about is really this consideration of total carbon. It's not enough to think about carbon over here and energy over here. We need to be summing them up and considering what that means and how we make decisions around that. So I think some of the things that we're beginning to see change in this space as we work towards a preservation first approach to total carbon are one, a sort of a reduction to the extent that we see energy, sort of carve outs within the energy code created for existing buildings. And I think this is a good thing. If we're going to argue that the greenest building is the one that's already built, we can't use that as an excuse to be wasteful in other respects. So that doesn't always mean completely changing how we preserve, but it does mean thinking creatively. And again, using an example from our project out at MoCA, for us, the decision to not insulate these exterior walls came with a lot of thinking about how we could broaden set points within most of the space and create sort of buildings within the building that were more tightly controlled where they needed to be, so that we weren't sort of defeating the total carbon goals of the project through operations. I think this also means advocating for how kind of the de facto ruling bodies of preservation act and how their standards, in this case, the Secretary of Interior standards, are applied. We still run up against resistance to things like added insulation, which would thicken walls, even when finishes are being replaced on both sides anyway. So there's advocacy that needs to happen up the chain, and education that needs to happen up the chain as well. And I will briefly pass it back to Laurie, who has some exciting news before we go to our breakout sessions.
Yeah, thanks. Just really quickly, I wanted to let those of you who haven't heard about this tool yet know that I have been working on a tool with Larry Strain at Siegel and Strain and with Aaron McDade of Architecture 2030 and with the support of the Carbon Leadership Forum and the ZNCC, which is the Builder Knotsville calculator, which will be a very simple high-level tool that estimates and compares 3 scenarios, doing nothing to an existing building, reusing it and upgrading it and replacing it with new construction. And the idea is that this will be able to, before you have a building design and without doing a whole life cycle assessment, you'll be able to kind of look at those options and quantify the benefits of reuse, or if not, what you need to do to make that building lower carbon in the near term and over whatever time frame, critical time frame you choose. So this is exciting, and should be releasing it pretty soon. All right.
So I think with that, this information will also be on our Miro boards in our breakout sessions. So if you haven't already found the Miro link, you can try to find that, or the moderators in the breakout sessions should also be able to find that link and share it within those sessions. But we're hoping in these discussions to hear questions, hear ideas, hear concerns that we can share back to the larger group and hopefully use as sort of deep dives in the next series.
And George, we're going to do these for 15 minutes. We're going to break out, so we have time to come back and summarize. I think in the interest of time, I think who was for Lori or George, you all somebody had breakout number 1, so they can report.
Yeah.
Okay, Lori.
Okay, the quick version. We had a lot of good discussion. I think we happened upon one big challenge, which is that the decision to reuse happens before architects get involved, and definitely before you do a detailed life cycle assessment. So how do we make this statement to owners before we're even part of a project, and how do we have high level data like the build tool, that kind of tool that allows this type of decision to happen very early, before construction and before permitting at the beginning. And then also, how do we use carbon as just as a benefit to the values that a client already cares about, like cost, like schedule, like their cultural identity, like the need for swing space? How do we sort of weave that in and make it an added bonus?
Fantastic. George, I think you are next.
Yeah, so a couple of key takeaways. There was a lot of discussion in our group about how conversations take place around reuse, particularly with clients. I think the previous group's point about this often being decided before we show up is a good one. But even if it hasn't been decided when you show up, how do you educate a client about embodied carbon? Someone in our group made a great point that all architects, but particularly architects working in the sort of intersecting spheres of sustainability and preservation need to be used to advocacy as part of their job and not just something we do in these discussion groups. And then once that baseline is established, how do we explain metrics? What does 50 kilograms of carbon per square foot versus 5 versus 100 mean for the world? Another point was about the nimbleness of tools. As we push for total carbon being the consideration, often architects are doing carbon models, engineers are doing models about operational energy. How do we bring those together in sort of a nimble enough way that it doesn't slow down a decision-making process? And finally, a call that the culture of buildings remains relevant even as we surface these sort of technical and issues of global importance.
Rochelle.
Hi, group 3. We began diving into how a marketplace for preservation, reuse, salvaging can happen. And we dove into many aspects of what makes that difficult. So how do you incentivize for contractors and builders to reuse materials? How does a city set up resources needed, the labor skill, the space that's needed, the resources? How do you vet and certify materials, especially if they're going to be used for something that pertains to life safety, for example? So those were some of the questions that we began with. We then brought in the conversation about the very assumptions of what happens when we are working with preservation. It's kind of a dance to understand what needs to be replaced and when. For example, windows, where do we add PVs? So, some of the assumptions that we make going into the projects need to sort of be scrutinized at an earlier stage, and we need to understand values and goals, why we're doing what we're doing. Then we went broader into campus planning, and we had Ludmilla join us from UMass Amherst talking about the many modernist brutalist buildings that are existing, contain lots and lots of concrete, but are not loved, or they're not yet loved. And so there's, a need to educate and raise awareness about why we take care of these buildings rather than demolish them and rebuild, or try to make them go away. So there's sort of a broader conversation about what we value in these buildings, why, and how we approach it. And then finally, we were sort of asking the question of what else is being done out there, and broader, like what are other countries doing to tackle these questions? What are ways to communicate to a broader mainstream public and broader client client base?
Wonderful. All right, I'll try to summarize. Our group really benefited from having a diverse perspectives in terms of where people sit. But one of the key takeaways, like we've heard from everybody else, is education. That we have a lot of owners and a lot of entities who are so familiar with LEED. They've been focused on the operational carbon for 2 decades plus, and how do we ensure that it's not just still the drive to LEED checklists and driving down operational carbon? How do we better educate the owners, practitioners, as well as society in general? We had a really interesting point brought up that, our idea about, what we need in terms of, we always need something new, because new is bigger and it's better and it's more efficient. Or for thermal comfort, we need it to be a certain cool, right? Which is not the cool that everybody in the rest of the world thinks is okay, right? Like people can deal with slightly hotter temperatures. Deborah reminded us, as somebody who's from South America. Then we have, I think Tony brought up a really good point of framing the subject with language that is either familiar or understandable to the audience. So, we have EUI for operational carbon, and we need some way to sort of get to embodied carbon or talk about embodied carbon. And Tony, if I'm misstating you, feel free to jump in. But we need kind of a language that is familiar, repeatable, and that can kind of bring all of us together so that we can start addressing embodied carbon. Yeah. And I really think that the last point is that there's so much research out there, from universities and think tanks and others, that just needs to be day-lit. Like, we need to bring it to practitioners and owners and all the spaces, translate it so that it can be understood, but that we have the knowledge we need. It's about dissemination beyond, somebody said it already, beyond sort of this group of us. We need to figure out how to make it widely available and actionable. So I think those were some common themes, but I'm not sure if Lori or George, if you have any sort of final kind of summations. Lori, I should mention that, that talking about talking about sort of universities and historic structures, and really having a tool that makes it easier for people who practice in the space of preservation and reuse to show those numbers and the impact of reuse, so that it's more easily understood. That's important.
Yeah, I think I would just add just a couple of things in response to some of what I heard from all of the groups. First of all, to Lisa's point about the tool, there was excitement, Lori, in our section of the discussion about your tool coming out as perhaps being that kind of nimble translator between operational and embodied carbon. And I think, a few other things that I heard, one about the wonderful concrete buildings at UMass Amherst. I don't mean that sarcastically. I love those buildings, even if if no one else does, or few other people do. I was in my one slide about embodied carbon, I chose City Hall as my preservation priority example, which I understand is controversial in some circles. And I think, those buildings in particular, obviously a huge amount of carbon went into making them. So from that perspective, we owe it to ourselves to get as much out of that as we can. And also a huge amount of carbon would go into taking them down. So in terms of avoided impacts, there's huge potential there. And then I saw in the chat something about public school buildings. So I just wanted to make sure people knew that there is a public, there's the municipal summit, and then a sort of public bid impact series on one of the follow-up dates, I think the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken.
This Friday is the municipal summit. So if you're interested in that, Rochelle will have a slide at the end with contact information. You can also go to BSA's website or Built Environment Plus. And I think we have about 75 people attending from a number of different municipalities. And then we have another event as part of this series on the 22nd that's going to focus on public bid and public projects. So.
And then my final point, and then I'll pass it to Lori, is just around the comment about EUI. And in our work, we've always tried to boil it down to kilograms CO2 per square foot so that we can compare it. But that absolutely has not had the branding exercise that EUI has gotten for over a decade now. So I think there's work to be done to either make something that's easier to say than kilograms of CO2 per square foot, or otherwise get that out there in the world.
Oh, I think it's been summed up well. I don't know if I want to make sure we have time for whatever closing remarks Lisa or Rochelle needed to make.
I don't need to make any, but Rochelle had a few, I think. You're muted, Rochelle.
Thank you. Am I sharing my screen?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I think this is George's screen.
Oh.
Oh, do you want to share your screen?
Just briefly.
Yeah, okay.
So at the end of these conversations, we try to have as part of our wrap up, a next steps slide, thinking about some of the major themes of our discussion and what that can possibly mean in terms of actionable next steps. The idea here is to think about it as like, what are the immediate actions? What are the low-hanging fruits? What you have listed here are the themes that I've been capturing as we write, working with cities and municipalities on knowledge building, asking where resources incentives are, and starting to create that marketplace. And I think we have an opportunity to engage with these questions at the Municipality Summit coming up this Friday. The next action step is something that we all can do as practitioners, which is awareness and education. It's something we can do every day, every time we interact with a client, every time we talk to our teams or with our consultants. But maybe we want to think about, certainly within the CLF Boston hub, is there a toolkit perhaps that can help, that we can help share with a broader community? Is there a cheat sheet that might provide some guidance? And then the next two, creating marketplace is redundant, please excuse that. The next two are broader ones. The language from Embodied Carbon, I think, is something that we can start to codify and collaborate with the CLF National and with other active hubs around the country and around the world about creating a codified language or using terms that are particularly helpful, especially in communications. And finally, disseminating tools such as Lori's To Build tool that she introduced earlier today, and making that a much more frequent go-to and accessible manner to start to collect data and gather data for embodied carbon. Lisa, George, Lori, would you like to add anything else as next steps, actionable items?
I think that's it. I think in respect of people's time, we should probably wrap it up.
Okay.
And if people feel like we missed anything, you still have access to the Miro board after this event. So you can add to it there. And hope to see you at future CLF Boston events, including this Thursday's one focused on landscape. So thank you.